Hello viewers, welcome to this particular lecture on microbiology. In this particular lecture, I shall be discussing some aspects of sulfur and phosphorus cycle. I'll start with phosphorus cycle. I'll be talking about the different events in the phosphorus cycle and how the microbes are responsible for the interconversion of phosphorus. And I will also tell you how human factors actually affect this particular cycle. And then I shall conclude with the sulfur cycle, stating the different events of sulfur cycle, and in the same way I shall also tell you about the anthropogenic effect on the sulfur cycle. Now, sulfur and phosphorus cycle is not simple gaseous cycle like carbon cycle, like oxygen cycle. They are the sedentary cycles.
Sir, why the cycle is called sedentary cycle?
You see, sedentary cycle is because that they are limited to the terrestrial environment and they are not really going into the atmosphere. Mainly they remain into the soil or in the rock and sometimes can get into the sediment of the sea. So they are called sedimentary cycle, or sometimes they are called sedentary cycle because they are remaining in the terrestrial environment. So phosphorus cycle, the major events as you can see here, starts from the plant and the animal phosphate, and they are normally stored in that particular plant and animal body, and after their death and decay they are decomposed and coming into the phosphate, which is inorganic phosphate of the soil or the rock, and then they are sometimes going into the sea or ocean and they are deposited in the sediment, and artificially human is taking up this particular rock phosphate and making fertilizers, and this fertilizer again may get weathered and going back to the sea. Otherwise, this particular phosphate in fertilizer will get into the plant body and again the cycle will be repeated. So this is more or less the major events in a particular phosphorus cycle. But one important thing is that though I have said that the plant biomass contains phosphorus, then the question is, this phosphate is obtained from the soil. So the phosphorus should be soluble in water so that it can be absorbed by the plant root. So primarily, the microbial activity in the soil is very important, and they maintain the balance between this inorganic and the organic phosphate of the soil. To a great extent, it is usually the inorganic phosphate which is easily moving, and the organic phosphate normally is remaining sedentary in the particular soil. But of course, anytime and every time, whenever we die, that means the plant and animal die, this phosphate will be enriched into the soil again. As I was telling you, then the major events of our phosphorus cycle will be like this: presence of phosphorus in the plant and animal body, then transfer of that phosphorus after their death and decay, and then reconversion into inorganic phosphate back to this particular phosphate of the particular soil. So this is how this particular interconversion occurs, and the balance between the phosphorus in plant body, in the biotic component and in the abiotic component is maintained. As I was telling you, that microbial activity is very important, and this microbial activity normally will be the conversion of different insoluble sulfate into, or different insoluble phosphate into soluble phosphate, and this soluble phosphate will be taken up by the plant, and they are taken up usually by orthophosphate or phosphoric acid and utilized within the plant body, and then again they will be going back to the soil. So this is how this particular microbes present in the root atmosphere or the rhizosphere play a very vital role. You can understand very well that the phosphate present in the soil can very well get into the sea or into the ocean, and this particular phosphate will actually cause high mineralization into the sea, and this particular phenomenon is called eutrophication. Eutrophication commonly in the sea will result in algal bloom or rapid growth of algae, and this algae will again die and again will add phosphorus to the sediment. Of course, here phosphorus will also react with oxygen producing phosphate. But remember, phosphate is always acting as a limiting nutrient for aquatic life cycle or aquatic environment.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
Sir, why phosphorus is limiting agent?
Yeah, phosphorus is limiting agent because phosphorus will finish off very early before all the other nutrients are finished. So that's why it is called the limiting agent. I was telling you, primarily the phosphorus is added to the soil apart from getting decomposed by fertilizers. So fertilizer contains NPK, where the normal proportion for an agricultural land is 18 parts nitrogen, 24 parts phosphorus and only 6 parts potassium. So this is actually enriching the soil with huge amount of phosphorus. And when this particular phosphorus in the soil present as fertilizer, also it may be present in detergent, is washed away by rainwater into the water body, inland water body, into the stream, then they will cause pollution. And this particular detergent pollution is causing frothing in the water body, and very often this particular eutrophic condition will result in massive growth of algae, commonly called algal bloom. So basically, if we consider the availability of phosphorus or distribution of phosphorus in majority of living organism or majority of non-living component, phosphorus remain as orthophosphate. So orthophosphate is the chief molecule present in nature. But when it is present in the sediment, they are present in the form of a particular salt, which is calcium phosphate. You can very well see here the calcium phosphate is forming a chain-like compound, and this particular structure is called apatite. So apatite is a phosphate mineral present in the rock, and this particular rock containing phosphate very often gets weathered. Weathering of phosphate rock is a very common phenomenon, and this particular phosphate rock gets weathered how? Actually washed by the rainwater containing acid, or they may be actually acted upon by different bacteria. So you can very well see this particular rock gets poured, or there are definite porous nature of the particular rock which will carry the phosphate into the sea, ocean, because the river is flowing and it will carry the phosphate into the sea. Of course, here I must say that there is another way of enriching ocean phosphate, which is through guano.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
What is guano?
Yeah, guano is actually excreta of marine bird. Marine bird contain huge amount of phosphate in their excreta, and this phosphate directly will get into the sediment of the ocean. So on one side, the terrestrial rock gets weathered and give the phosphate to the sea. In the same time, the biotic components in the form of birds will add phosphate into the seawater. So let us come to the biological importance of phosphate. I told you already, phosphorus is present in ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is the adenosine molecule with the adenine, with the pentose sugar, and the 3 molecules of phosphate. And these, this second and third are high energy phosphate, which will break down liberating heat, which are acting as energy currency in all living organisms. Apart from that, phosphate is present in our DNA. Phosphate is actually adding up the pentose sugar, and they will create the backbone of the DNA. So this particular phosphate sugar linkage will be called phosphodiester linkage, and it is binding with the basically the nitrogen bases that will create the complete DNA structure. So DNA is also containing phosphorus in huge amount, and there is also phosphorus present in the bone and teeth. And very often, when there is osteoporosis, then this osteoporosis might result due to phosphorus deficiency or porous stature of the bone. Okay?
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
Why phosphorus causes osteoporosis?
Yeah. You see, calcium salt, that is calcium phosphate, is present in bone. So naturally, calcium deficiency as well as phosphorus deficiency both can cause osteoporosis or spongy texture of the bone. Okay? I was telling that phosphate is also present in the form of phospholipid in the living cell membrane, and this phospholipid is having a glycerophosphate head and the fatty acid tail, and this fatty acid, this is saturated and this is unsaturated with a double bond. So phospholipid concentration is also a very important constituent of living cell. And very importantly, in all living system, phosphorus or phosphate is acting as a biological buffer, because phosphoric acid on one side is acidic in nature, on the other side, when this phosphoric acid is broken into phosphate, liberating H plus ion, this phosphate will be taken up by some sodium or potassium ion, which will make the pH alkaline. So thereby the pH balance in human body or in animal body can be regulated by phosphate. And when we consider the major types of phosphorus, it is like this: phosphorus which is commonly present as soluble phosphate, phosphorus which is present as soil organic phosphate, phosphorus which is present in biomass, and very importantly, phosphorus which is fixed in the soil or in the rock, which normally is remaining there as a constant fact. And when we consider this phosphorus flow, then it will be basically from the land to water. From the land to water, this phosphorus will be coming, it will be solubilized, and these aquatic plants will take up this phosphorus easily. And thereby, when these plants are grazed by animal, it will easily be taken up by animals. So in other way, the phosphorus is removed from the water body at a faster pace in comparison to the phosphorus which is trapped in the land. Now I was telling that phosphorus is taken up by the living cell, but how? Actually speaking, phosphorus uptake is by some incorporation into the sugar molecule. So directly glucose can be converted to glucose 6-phosphate, which is trapping of phosphorus. Glucose 6-phosphate can directly be utilized into the living system, into the glycolytic cycle. Or on the other hand, glucose may be converted to gluconate through an enzyme, glucose dehydrogenase, where PQQ is the cofactor, and this particular phosphogluconate will also be an important way by which phosphorus is trapped in the cell. And thereby we can understand very well that every living organism commonly have the ability to make the trapped phosphorus in the soil to living organism, and thereby making it solubilized. So there may be different bacteria like Arwinia, like Pseudomonas, like Enterobacter, like Serratia, like Pseudomonas. They are all helping, or Synechococcus, they are all helping in solubilization of phosphate through specific phosphate solubilizing enzyme. And in this particular activity, I was telling, there is dehydrogenase, the key enzyme, which is aided by this particular PQQ or pyroquinoline quinone, which is helping in the activation of quinoprotein dehydrogenase and thereby helping in the trapping of phosphorus in the organic component of the living organism like the microbes. And there are specific genes which are responsible for the activation of this particular PQQ or activation of phosphorus solubilization, and these particular genes are different in Glucanobacter, Acinetobacter, Klebsiella or Methylobacterium. So every bacteria mentioned here may have a different system of gene which will solubilize phosphorus. So I was telling that phosphate present in the soil must be going into the plant, and this is brought about by the bacteria and fungi. So this bacteria present in the rhizosphere directly will make the phosphate solubilized, and this phosphate solubilized will enter into the plant body, it will be utilized there, and may at the end of the day after death and decomposition will come back. In the same way, there may be the fungi which are the rhizosphere mycorrhizal fungi which will again solubilize this phosphate, orthophosphate, and supplying it to the root. So rhizosphere microscopic organisms are very important for the interconversion of insoluble phosphate to soluble phosphate, or rather I must say it is conversion of phosphorus or transfer of phosphorus from abiotic to biotic phase. But at the end of the day, I should understand, or we should understand, that phosphorus cycle is greatly affected by different human activities, and this activity may be in the form of fertilization. Fertilizer is added to the soil in excess, and thereby phosphate deposition is in excess. There will be more erosion and there will be more eutrophication in the water body, and in the same way this phosphorus can get into the animal body and they may cause problem, toxicity. Phosphorus toxicity may also be there in the animal body. So ultimately this phosphate excess or excess of phosphate deposition both in land and water is because of the application of human beings, and that must be controlled so that we can reduce phosphate pollution or excess of phosphate in the sediments. Now let us come to the next important aspect, which is the sulfur cycle. Now sulfur in nature actually remain as this particular S32. This is the molecular structure of S32. Apart from that, sulfur may remain as different isotopes. There may be 25 different isotopes, but primarily sulfur remain as S32 and S34. And that also S32 is about 95% and S34 is around 4%. So these are the two major key players of sulfate present in the nature. So when we consider sulfur cycle, primarily we consider the movement of S32. And that also is moving in the following way. That is the, say for example, the formation of sulfur dioxide, then the formation of sulfate. Sulfur dioxide is temporary in the environment, then it comes to the sulfate of the soil, and then it is converted to sulfide. So sulfate to sulfide conversion is again microbial, and then again this sulfide is taken up by the different metal salts and ultimately producing metallic sulfides, which can also be entering into living organism. And in this way, the balance between sulfate and sulfide are the key process, or is the key process in nature. And in this case also, there may be different activities like the oxidation, the assimilative reduction, the assimilative reduction and mineralization. And in many ways, this sulfate reduction or mineralization is brought about by microbes, which include different bacteria. And when we consider the different bacteria, there may be sulfur oxidation by thiobacillus, or there may be thiothrix. At the same time, there may be sulfur reduction by assimilatory photosynthetic bacteria, or sulfur oxidation also by another bacteria. So you can very well understand that the interconversion of sulfur is greatly brought about by different bacteria. And you can see here that this particular aquatic environment also contains sulfur. There may be upper oxygenic and lower anoxygenic environment where greatly the sulfur interconversion, meaning the sulfide is converted to zero sulfur state, or sulfide is converted to sulfate, or sometimes sulfate is converted to sulfide, is all by microbial process. But in one way, this particular process is getting slightly different when there is some oil deposit present in the nature. And this oil deposit commonly will be there. Suppose this is called the subsurface channel of sulfur, where it starts with sulfate, then it is converted to sulfide, and again finally under the action of thiobacillus it is converted to S0 state, which is under oxidative environment. So in the way we can understand that this sulfur interconversion to a great extent will limit a particular oil field in a specific area. Now coming to the different ways or different processes involved in sulfur interconversion. One such important interconversion is the green sulfur bacteria converting organic sulfur in the form of thiol compounds to inorganic sulfur, which is H2S. And this is actually directly, we can say, conversion of inorganic sulfur to, or organic sulfur to inorganic sulfur. There may be different forms of this sulfur interconversion, where we can see the aerobic organisms like thiobacillus is helping in the conversion of H2S to sulfate. Similarly, there may be the conversion of H0 to H2S by desulfuromonas, or similarly desulfovibrio will convert H2O3 to H2S. So these are the different microbial conversion of sulfur into different soluble forms. Actually speaking, the two key players in microbial world will be the sulfur reducing bacteria, which will be actually removing the oxygen from the sulfur, making S0 or making S-2. But the other one is conversion of S-2 to S0 by sulfur oxidizing bacteria. So these are the two key players. So when we consider the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, this oxidation of hydrogen sulfide commonly is a very common process where H2S will be converted step by step into S0 state. You can understand there are at least 6 different stages where there will be iron very much important as a catalyst. And ultimately this S0 will be available to the nature. Maybe it will bind with hydrogen to produce H2S. But the question is when I talk about sulfate reduction, this sulfate reduction can be dissimulative or can be assimilative. Now, this is an example of dissimulative sulfate reduction, where you can see clearly that this particular sulfate is getting inside as FeS, and finally it is converted to hydrogen sulfide, where I am taking the help of sulfate with APS or adenosine phosphosulfate. So this type of sulfate reduction is known as biological sulfate reduction or BSR. At the same time, this entire chemical process can occur at high temperature and it is called TSR. So what are the advantages of BSR over TSR?
Sir, maybe TSR needs higher temperature.
Precisely. TSR will need temperature of 160 degrees centigrade, while BSR may occur at 60 degrees centigrade. Moreover, TSR being a physical process will require longer period. So is it clear? BSR is an advantageous process. In the same way, I was talking about assimilatory sulfate reduction, where in addition to APS, there will be the phosphoadenosine phosphosulfate involved in the process, where sulfate is converted to APS and APS is finally converted to H2S on one side. At the same way, APS can be converted to PAPS or phosphoadenosine phosphosulfate, and finally it is converted to H2S. So this type of process is called assimilatory sulfate reduction, where the key player is this one, which is the PAPS, phosphoadenosine phosphosulfate, which can lose the sulfur immediately and will be converted to phosphoadenosine phosphate. So let us talk about the different sources or sinks of sulfur. Now sulfur is found in different oxidation state. It is from +6 to -2. So it is a huge range. So they may be present in the igneous rock, they may be present in the ocean bed, they may be present in the atmosphere, and primarily they may be carried by the water body into the ocean. There may be sulfate present in the living organism. So there are different sources, and very importantly, sulfur is present in the rock in the form of copper or iron pyrites, and they are trapped with the metal. In the ocean surface, there is a very common phenomenon, which is conversion of dimethyl sulfonate to dimethyl sulfonionpropionate, or this particular conversion of DMS to DSP or DMSP is actually by the different microbes or phytoplanktons present in the sea, and very common. The characteristic odor given by the sea water is because of this compound, which is sulfur compound, or also called DMSP. Now let us consider how the sulfate cycle has been evolved with the evolution of Earth. So the existence of Earth, you know, is around 4.6 billion years. At that time, there was no S34. Then between 4.6 to 2.5 billion years ago, the Archean system evolved. Between 3.8 to 3.6, there was the actual exposure of the geologic record where the strata is formed, and then also this particular isotopic value of AC was 0. But it was around 3.5 billion years that this anoxygenic photosynthesis resulted in the production of some sulfate in the hydrosphere. But even at that time, the radioactive sulfur was 0. S34 was 0. It was around 3.4 billion years that there was some fractionation with the conversion of sulfate to sulfide. And maybe around 2.8 billion years ago, there was the evidence of oxygen production which caused the sulfur oxidation, and you see both the cycles evolved hand in hand. Both oxygen and sulfur cycle evolved hand in hand. And it was around 2.5 billion years ago the first sign of this radioactive sulfur was there. It was around 2.3 billion years ago there was gradual oxygenation event, and this particular oxygenation event, meaning the reducing environment of the earth was converted to oxygenic environment, and this created more sulfate. Where? In the ocean. And this particular increase in sulfate, very important, is actually coinciding with a typical banded iron formation. We call it BIF formation around 1.5 billion years ago. And this particular banded iron formation is also going along with the Archean evolution. You see, this particular iron and sulfur will react with each other, creating FES centers. So these FES centers are found in where? In the respiratory cycle. So they are the energy generating centers. So that might be a possible way of origin of life. So it was around 750 million years ago. This particular BIF continued along with Ice Age. Ice Age was there, but even then BIF continued. And around 600 million years ago, this particular seawater sulfate increased and more or less touched the level which is coinciding with the present day value. Around 10 million years ago, oxygen is getting incorporated, and gradually the oxygen getting into the sulfur will react to produce sulfate. More sulfate, then reduction to produce sulfide. So the reaction increased. And ultimately, in the present day cycle, that is 2 million years ago, there was further reduction of this sulfate, which is getting incorporated into the living organism, which coincides with the biodiversity of the living world. Clear? So, at the end of the day, I told you, human actually is causing disruption of this cycle. It is not a variation. Here also the same thing. You are continually burning different coal, petroleum, which contains sulfur. And this sulfur will liberate sulfur dioxide, more sulfur dioxide in the environment. What will be there? There will be acid rain. And this acid rain will be because of the production of sulfuric acid, which will reduce the rainwater pH to 3 to 4. And what will be there? There will be distinct damage to the buildings, there will be distinct damage to the leaves, there will be distinct damage to the vegetation and also to the soil microbes. And this particular damage will ultimately destroy the biodiversity, will destroy the microbial population, will actually reduce agricultural production. So basically, when we consider these effects, these are direct effects. You can see stone cancer because of acid rain, defoliation because of acid rain, these damages in the leaf lamina because of acid rain. So this type of damage will ultimately change or modify the biodiversity of the world, reducing the productivity. So we have learned the different aspects of sulfur, different aspects of sulfur cycle, and we have also learned the different aspects of phosphorus cycle and how these cycles have been modified by human agency. Thank you.